I'm quite happy to introduce you to Mette Skov from Denmark. She is assistant professor at Aalborg University of the Department of Communication and Psychology. And her research interest is on online access of cultural collections. And I think that's a very big issue for museums, for sure. Mette will give us an insight into a case study she did for the National Military Museum in Copenhagen, and she will also talk about, and I think that's a very interesting aspect too, about the motivation people look into the Europeana, which is a cross-domain portal which likes to make European cultural heritage widely accessible.
So the agenda for my speech today is that I want to present a case study, and that was the study I did in relation to my PhD work. And it's a case study of the National Museum of Military History in Copenhagen. And then I just want to kind of briefly talk about some selected findings from a study on user motivation in relation to the Europeana website. And I want to end up with a few reflections on what might be the next steps. So, my background and motivation for doing this kind of research is that, as we all know, museums are embedded with technology, and we spend a lot of money and resources on making museum collections available online. But to my best knowledge, we still lack comprehensive studies on how remote access users interact, navigate, and search these online collections. So the topic of my presentation is not the use of technology within the physical museum. Instead, it is the use of, it's the remote access remote access and how people search and navigate and browse and interact with online collections. Sitting at home or sitting at work or sitting at a cafe or whatever, but outside the physical museum, okay? And my approach is a user-centered approach. So my underlying assumption is that in order to create improved digital access to museum resources, it is very important that we improve our understanding of the information seeking and searching behavior of online museum visitors, including what I call the social and cultural context of these users. So now I'll start with the first study, my case study at the Museum of Military History in Copenhagen. I finished this study a couple of years ago, but nevertheless, I hope it's still relevant. The purpose of the study was to characterize online museum visitors' information seeking and searching behavior. That is, why online museum collections are used, and also how. So these two questions very much reflect to the information searching part of my research. So that is the very, you may say, narrow or focused part, where I study how people interact when they sit in front of the computer, how they type in search strings, how they browse and navigate and interact with the content. So that is one part. And the other part of my studies take a bit broader aspects, and that is the part I call information-seeking behavior. So the part of information-seeking behavior addresses a broader spectrum that addresses the context and what I call user practice. So it's interested in users' motivation and information needs. In library and information science, the concept of information need is highly central, but reading the work of John Falk, maybe we should extend this. We do realize this information need arises within a cultural and social context, and the whole part of user motivation also derives from that part. So we have this the more narrow point of view, and then the broader part also included the user practice. And in this case study, it quite quickly became apparent that the users in questions were what denotes special interest museum visitors, and what fork denotes professional or hobbyist. When I just first started out doing this research, I was, kind of open, and I hoped that I would see all kinds of online museum visitors, but it very quickly became apparent that because I wanted to examine how people interact with the online collections, at least in this particular case study, it was this group of special interest museum visitors. Okay. A bit about the methodological approach. It was an exploratory case study. I used a triangulation of data collection methods. So I started doing analysis of written inquiries to the museum, both by old-fashioned mail and also email. And that was because I needed to get an understanding of what kind of questions and what kind of issues are the users interested in. At the same time, I was very aware that if you actually sit down and write an email to a museum, you have to be very dedicated and very persistent in really wanting an answer to your question. So I hoped also to find a broader range of interest area when I looked into the online museum access. But that was my starting point, and from there I did an online questionnaire survey. And the online questionnaire survey had two purposes. Firstly, it was important to me to get like a sort of a basic insight into what were their areas of research, were they experienced searcher, and what were their background, how also their demographics information. But the second and also very important purpose of this online questionnaire was that I wanted volunteers to take part in what I call my actual user study. Because when you research into online museum visitors, in the beginning you don't know who you are dealing with. You don't know your users. Maybe you have an idea, but you don't know much about them. So to me, it was very important to get in contact with them and communicate with them also in person. And quite a few volunteered to take part in my user study. I ended up having, I think, only 24. And my user study was divided into two parts. Again, reflecting that I'm both interested in the searching part, where they sit in front of the computer and search and interact with the collections. So that is the simulated search task situations, where I simulate information needs. So I say, okay, imagine that you are going to visit the museum and you want to know what's going on in the museum, so what you want to get acquainted with their collections. Or imagine that you are very interested in the Second World War, and now you want to see what has the museum on this particular topic. And then I use software so I can log the screen activities. And then when the users have done these 4 simulated work tasks, I replayed the logging of the screen captures. And then I did a retrospective think aloud session. So I ask them afterwards, okay, I can see that now you're reading this, and I can see that you navigate here and press this button and press this button, and all of a sudden you go back and rephrase your search. Why do you do that? Yes, that was the first part of the study. And the second part of the study looked more into the user practice part. So I was very interested in hearing their background and their motivations, and yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the results. As I said before, it quickly was apparent that in this particular study, the participants are special interest museum visitors pursuing a long-standing interest or hobby. So I read the work of a Canadian sociologist called Robert Stebbins, and he's done a lot of work into hobbyists and different categories of hobbyists. And it was very rewarding to me to read his studies, because two of his categories very much reflect the characteristics and the trends that I saw in my data. So roughly my participants can be divided into collectors and liberal arts enthusiasts. And collectors, they develop a technical knowledge of the commercial, social, or physical circumstances in which the fancied items are acquired. So collectors have very much focused on the particular objects. Whereas the liberal arts enthusiasts, they have a much broader perspective. So they have this systematic and fervent pursuit during free time of knowledge for their own sake. So in this case, it was that they were interested in military history or history in general. Also, when I looked at the results, I found that the information needs that they expressed were surprisingly well defined. When I read studies of visitor studies in the physical museums, I very often read that visitors in the physical museum, they go around browsing, like they're window shopping. So I would have expected that also online museum visitors were browsing and navigating around. But when I asked them about their information needs, they were surprisingly well defined. They knew very well what they were looking for. This said, 30% of the questionnaire respondents said that they were not looking for anything specific. So there's also a part of the users that are exploring and just waiting to be surprised and inspired. Okay, then I just show two quotations illustrating what I think is very interesting, this differentiation between collectors and, on the next slide, the liberal arts enthusiasts. Because if you look into this, these special interest visitors, it is very apparent that their interest and what they are looking for at the museum website differs a lot. So if you take this, the collectors, this phrase says that they are not interested in learning about the historical eras and so on. No, he says that my interest goes the other way around. I become fascinated by an object and start by examining the object. And then, maybe, I would say, he look into how it has been used and its historical relations. So the main interest of the collector is the museum object. If you turn to the liberal art enthusiasts, on the other hand, they are interested in the general historic perspective. For instance, he says that he is interested in the military history development and how it affected the general history development. So he's interested in German military history from 1700 and forward. So he says that objects become interesting because they help explain how some weapons that apparently were just decisive are used or were used. So to him, it's this broader perspective on understanding history. And then because the collectors form such an important and large part of my study, I also became interested in what makes people collect. And we don't talk about professional collectors, we talk about laypersons who collect. And they were a bit surprised often about this question because I didn't really reflect on it. And one said, never ask a collector why he collects. He doesn't know, that's just the way it is. There's something fascinating about it. But also when I asked this question, I got very lengthy answers because they are so devoted to this, and they're also very pleased that someone will listen to them. And there was this other participant. I don't think I'll read it up aloud, but he's collected objects since he was a small boy, and he goes on telling about all the different kinds of objects that he has collected. And very, very often I also hear about their wives and how the wives complains about all this stuff they keep collecting. Yes. Okay. So I also, both in the questionnaire and also when I did the simulated such task situations, I looked into what I call preferred data elements. And preferred data elements this is in Danish, I'm sorry, but it's what kind of information are they looking for? Are they looking for the time period or the title of a given object, or the date or the provenance or lengthy descriptions, or what are they interested in? And I think the most important result here is that the visual aspect is very, very strong. A photograph of the museum object is the most often mentioned data element, and very often they ask for more than one photo of each item. Many times they would like to see a photograph both from the front of the object and from behind. This said, you could also see that the preferred data elements differs whether you talk about collectors or liberal arts enthusiasts. The collectors are mainly interested in factual object-related information and the photos and a little about the provenance information. Whereas the liberal arts enthusiasts, they need various types of information, including this broad associated historic context information. So for you, those of you who design collections online, you should just know that parts of your audiences look for very different kinds of information. Okay, as part of looking into the user practice and the context of the online museum visitor, I also asked about what kind of other information sources and channels do they use. And it became apparent that they use a wide variety of information sources. So they both read books and go to the library to read about it, and then they use personal channels a lot. So they spend a lot of time discussing either with friends or families, but in this case, very often people who share their interests. And this very nicely reflects some of the earlier presentations today, that how can we support these personal relations when we talk about communication online. It is difficult, but we have to think and try how to support this. Then I also see in my data that the physical and the virtual museum or online museum is very much complementary. And that is, they go to the physical museum to see the items for real, to see the buildings and the surrounding. And one of them said to press my nose against the glass. And when they sit at home with their computer doing, I would say, research into their hobby, it's a completely different view they have. They do research and they explore, and they're just waiting for the museum to put more stuff online. Okay, so when we look at information searching behavior, and this is the part where I look into, okay, when the person sits in front of the computer, how does he navigate and interact with the collections? So again, very important that this is a highly visual experience. Photos are the most important feature, and photos are used as a browsing for identification and selection as a zooming device. If you do a search and you have a long list of results, this particular collection, they provided small thumbnails, so participants could very easily browse and very quickly browse to a lot of results, and using the photos to select. Then we also, here at the right-hand side, we also have this exploratory behavior. Some of their searches were non-goal directed, so it was what we call serendipity, so they find the unexpected. Even though that these users are lay experts within their field, they still get surprised and puzzled by some of the information. I had, in fact, 2 who were absolutely sure that the museum was wrong on this particularly. This must be wrong. I'd never heard of this before. And then they started to dig further into it and read more details. And then there was, oh, is that how it is? So absolutely there's this aspect of serendipity, and also looking for what I call the missing piece in the puzzle. They have, because they're so devoted to this area, they have a very often quite narrow focus, and they are very pleased and very excited when they find a new piece of the puzzle. Then there's also this thing about they mostly do very broad search. They type in very broad search keys. Maybe it's because they are unsure about the terminology used by the museum professionals. So in order to make sure that they're not missing anything, they take quite a wide approach, and then they accept that they have to go through a lot of material. Okay, so they accept high recall in order to secure high precision. Okay. And finally, I also addressed the concept of meaning making, because it was very apparent that they used their previous experience and knowledge when they interacted with these online collections. So in these collections, you are not, you are forced to, or you are free to, follow your own path around. And in doing so, you very much use your background knowledge to make information relevant to you. Yes. Okay. So, just a few concluding remarks. Participants' dedication and long-standing interests, and not at least they spent very much time on this particular hobby. This tells that their hobbies are very much integrated components of everyday practices. Also, it is apparent that within these 2 different classes of hobbyists, there are the collectors and the liberal arts enthusiasts, and the way they navigate and what they are looking for differs a lot. And also when we design online resources, it is very important that we both support browsing and keyword search and reflect on how we can support serendipitous discoveries, and then, not least, that we remember that this is a very strong visual experience. Okay. Okay, then I just have a few slides that I want to add, because I've been part of the clay community surrounding the clay conference, which was last year held in Spain. And the clay conference is a conference on evaluation. So there are different tracks devoted to different areas. So there's a track on cross-media search, and there's a track devoted to cross-language retrieval, and so on and so forth. And I took part in the track we call the CHIC. It's the Cultural Heritage Interactive track, so this is the only track that actually involves users. And last year we used a sub-test collection of the Europeana website, which I guess most of you know. And we did an evaluation study of this one, where we looked into user motivation and user engagement. So within this CLAY community, we are different universities taking part, and then we share research data. So we have 200 online questionnaires and 40 in-lab respondents. Yes. And I'm only going to present a small part of this study here today. We asked the participants to please explore the Europeana, so we gave them a very open and exploratory work task. And what was interesting was that, of course, we looked into how they searched and how they navigated and so on and so on. But when you want to know about, and this is a key interest to me, what motivates them, why do they come to this website, we asked them to explain if they added an item to a certain book bag function. So they said, this object is of particular interest to me, so I added to this book bag, and then they were prompted to tell us, why is this particular item relevant or interesting to you? And we had 222 user statements, and we categorized them. And by far, the most people said that they had some kind of personal interest. For example, I have an interest in engineering and technology history, or I like Tijan very much, and I consider this painting one of his masterpieces. When I looked into all these user statements, I also made the link towards some of the work by John Falk, because I would very much like to see if and how and in what way we can link this work onto online museum visitors. And at least, well, this study was not designed to specifically look into that aspect, but nevertheless, you can see some trends that makes me think, yes, we can go on further and examine this. For example, the explorer says, I was just browsing and found these, and they happened to catch my attention, or hunting for old objects is interesting. And there's the recharger who says that an item looked beautiful or aesthetically pleasing, and so on. Going further, we again can find some links. There's the persons who has a clear study or work-related interests, so that would be the professionals or hobbyists, who say that this might be a potential topic for an essay, or this relates to my research and teaching. And then there's also the one who says, this item is relevant to me because I want to show it to my son, so he's a facilitator of learning or knowledge. So, next steps. Well, in doing my PhD, I found myself very much deep into this particular user groups of special interest museum visitors. And carrying on, I would like to broaden this perspective to include more users and understand a more broader variety of motivations. And also how this, so one thing is to understand the motivations. Why do people search online collections of cultural heritage? But also, and how does this impact the way users interact with online museum context? And finally, then we can be informed on how to do the design. Yes. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.